So the feeling of the third world started around 250,000 years ago, and then we started to shift into the fourth world around 35,000 years ago. And so that process, how did that happen? Because I'm thinking of, for example, Edgar Cayce had said there were 3 destructions of Atlantis, one in 50,000 BC, one in 28,000 BC, because of their technology and using crystals, and then the final one, 9,600 BC. So the destruction of Atlantis doesn't quite follow the descent of consciousness into the third and fourth, or from the third to the fourth. So it seems like there was something happening with Atlantis before the destructions. There was this descent into matter, and then Cayce had said that when they destroyed a good bit of the planet in 28,000 BC, that was the peak of their technology, and they still had technology after 28,000 BC, but it wasn't at the same level. And so that was another question mark of, well, how does that correlate with your sense of the descent into the fourth world? So those are my questions, and what's the general timeline for how this process happened?
One of the biggest challenges, of course, is definitions.
Exactly. That's why I'm throwing out mine.
What is Atlantis?
Yes.
What is Lemuria? How does it tie into the different worlds?
Correct.
Well, you could say the main thing of Lemuria was second world, but it was a part of it that moved into the third.
Yes.
So how did exactly that shift happen from more a Lemurian, and they continue to have some Lemurian influences in the third world also,
right,
that ultimately through the fourth world led to the you can call most of the indigenous tribes of the Americas, right?
Right.
And some of them also in Australia and others. They're all descendant, I think, from the Lemurian descendants. So that third world is actually the most complicated. So when do you say now we talk about Atlantis? Well, my tendency is to do that because there are 3 main phases in the third world,
right,
is when we moved into the second phase, not in the first phase. The first is still pretty strongly Lemurian energy dominated.
Right.
So what exactly shifted that, I don't know. There's definitely influence, as far as I can feel, from outside the planet. Yeah?
Right.
So there is literally, you can say ET influence, whatever we nowadays call it, but I would call it extraterrestrial. It's outside the Earth, influenced aspects of the Earth. And one of the reasons is that we should not forget that the souls that came, also at a certain moment came back to where they were from and still have a connection with the Earth, and influenced from a better understanding some of the steps in order for the Earth to fulfill its purpose. So how those influences were, look at all the portals that we have found. All of them have an impact, have an effect on how things are unfolding. So there's a big gap in our knowledge.
Yes.
While in the first world and the second world, things were very clear. It was still high consciousness, it's still spiritual dominated, and it was a gradual going down because of the awareness that that's what needs to happen. But you can say the confusion, chaos, and more remembering and trying to define happened between the third and the fourth world.
Okay.
And the third world moved actually literally from the more spiritual oriented. It was still what we call the emotional body.
Right.
But as you know, even for us, the emotional body and the astral body have a very strong interaction. Yeah, they're very close to each other.
Okay.
So it's very easy to move from the astral into the emotional, but also from the emotional into the astral. So what happened is that actually already in the second phase, an increasing number of the people moved into the astral.
Okay.
And with that, you actually are moving already in the more physical elements. And it took a little bit longer for those that were the spiritual leaders to be also there. And by that time, many of let's say the major population was in the very low frequencies of the astral, which is very close to physical.
Right.
So with all the attempts to control, you can say the things went haywire and led to different levels of destruction already in the third world.
Okay.
Now then we moved into the fourth world. Well, initially, there was still a lot of knowledge. So there's a lot of what you could say Atlantis, and I put it between quotations,
Right.
that was moved into the fourth world.
Right.
So what Edgar Casey is doing, he says, well, there's still more Atlantean than what we are currently are, so he still calls it Atlantis, which is okay. Yeah.
Right.
So, and the farther destructions happened is in the time frames that he said, and I mostly agree with that.
Right.
But what you see, the last destruction was the destruction where Plato also is referring to.
Correct.
But then all already fourth world. Yeah, with
okay.
some etheric beings still, that are fading in and out. And that is also what you can see with the fourth world She, they fade in and out, between the etheric and the physical.
Okay.
At a certain moment, there was no fading out, with some very rare exceptions, of some very spiritual people that could literally fade in and out. We all plunged into that real physical phase. So that was not immediately the case when we talk about the fourth world. So in the beginning, maybe the first 15,000, 10, 15,000 were still pretty etheric, in their being. So, and there's still a lot of knowledge and connection with the etheric astral beings that have higher knowledge than we currently have.
Right.
Where you tap into that, but it all is physical, and that is where the mind over matter comes from, and that ultimately led to what we're doing now, mind over matter. We're still doing it.
Right.
Yeah? So by giving science let's say, the guidance into our actions, we are talking about control over matter, which is bound to lead to destruction unless we get enough wisdom to say, oh, wait a minute, we need to maybe include something else like spirituality, subtle energies, and maybe we then can balance it out enough. But that is where we are standing for.
Right.
So that whole third world is the most complex in the sense.
I agree.
And not that easy to grasp, because what we tend to do with our fourth world consciousness, we tend to go into that part that we can still to some degree more or less grasp. So you go in the last phase of Atlantis.
Right.
Yeah? And which is to some degree still very related to the first phase of our fourth world that we still tend to call Atlantis.
Right.
Yeah? And that also because of the definitions that were used by Plato and talked about the Atlanteans, right?
Right. Correct.
So I think that the people of the fourth world still find themselves to be Atlanteans and maintain that name.
Okay. Okay.
Based on their stories and traditions.
Right.
So, we talked about letting go of ideas, right?
Yes.
And this is one of those typical things. We cannot understand this whole dynamic if we hold on to the belief of any person. So you have to look into the energies and then say, okay, I don't know what the right terminology is, because we all have different terminology.
Sure.
But what were the steps?
And that's what I'm focusing on, because, it's okay. There's Edgar Casey and his story. There's like at least royal channels, the Pleiadians, okay, and the Pleiadians say we came to the Earth and we did some genetic experiments on you people to make you more like us, basically. And then you have Zechariah Sitchin saying Anunnaki came and did their genetic. So it seems like we had this main body of consciousness that came down from the first world through the second, through the third, and as that experience was happening, these ETs came and started tinkering with the hominids in the fourth world. And
I think most likely already with the third.
And okay, and so it seems like there was like a dual timeline or a dual experience going on, where you had the main body that we're the descendants of, and then you had these experiments going on with these primates that the ETs came and said, well, things aren't happening fast enough for us, we're going to upgrade the species. And so then it seems like around 10,000 BC those two consciousness streams started to merge, where the experiments they did on the hominids started to merge with our human experience. And so that's why I keep saying, well, the messy history theory, is that I understand our timeline or our descent in consciousness to this point, our mission, as it were. And then it also seems like other people were coming here and doing their own experiments, and at a certain point they merged, because we all have the same lifespan. But you read some of the old texts, like the Bible or something, and they talk about people living 900 years.
Sure.
And so it seemed like the timeline we came from, people lived longer. The hominids, I suspect, had the same lifespan we have now. And at a certain point, these two streams merged, and so we all ended up with the same lifespan.
Yeah, maybe. You know, one of the things we should not forget is that, in a sense, you can say the first two worlds
Right.
were easy in the sense that you create a body through which you work with the energy of the earth,
Right.
in harmony with the spiritual body
Right.
of Mother Earth.
Yes.
And then you have an energy body, a subtle body that resonates with, we call the mental body.
Okay.
So that was still pretty, you can say, cut and dry, so to speak.
Simple.
But then knowing and already seeing in the third world that it became more physical,
Right.
the big question was, okay, you have in the physical world, while all this process is going on of the human consciousness and the transcending, you also have the evolution in the system of Mother Earth, and those two were supposed to merge, come together at a certain moment.
Right.
So you see all the different steps from bacteria, and we go through the plants, the trees,
Yes.
the animals appeared, you know, and you see every step is needs a precondition. So each one
Sure.
is the precursor of the next one in a sense.
Mm.
So when you came to that point of, okay, now we need a system, a physical body, a physical unit
Mm.
that we call human now,
Right.
that need to be able to hold that soul in a way that it can translate what the soul is wanting as a purpose, so that it can begin to express, because they are supposed to be co-creators.
Right.
So you may understand that in a sense this Mother Earth evolution, but Mother Earth is not alone. She's part of this and she's part of that. We begin to understand more and more that everything is part of everything.
Correct.
So the key point for this whole coming together of the right consciousness with the right physical form,
Yes.
yeah, that needed to be influenced, so to speak,
Right.
by those who have been on Earth and knew what was supposed to happen.
Okay.
You know? So how that all in detail from our current knowledge, our current tapping into information, we don't have a clear picture, but there is definitely influence from what you can call ET,
Right.
which is still us. You know, there's no separation from us in the
Sure.
sense. You know?
Yeah.
But even there you have different levels, and they think that they need, and there's also some messed up stuff, all of that.
Right.
So what we see is that what we experience now is both the involution or devolution, whatever you want to call it, human consciousness, the evolution of Mother Earth, that are now literally at this point.
Right.
How is this continuing?
Right.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And how that is continuing is now depending on us,
Right.
but still supported by, wow, this whole universe in a sense.
Sure.
But with some a little bit more clearly than with others. So it is actually a very fascinating phase, because we are literally the ones that become aware of the merging of that, you know, devolution in consciousness needed to function in a physical body that is the result of the evolution of Mother Earth. And that means that we are now at the point, so how is evolution continuing? Wow, big question. That's why we need all those points. That's why we are doing all this work, and that's why, you know, a lot of people all over the world are on the spiritual path, because they know something needs to happen, because it begins to come through in the awareness of those physical systems.
Right.
So they say, oh, I need to become more spiritual, and and whatever people do. Doesn't matter, as long as the energy is shifting. So that's why I understand why many talk about the start of a new world, because we literally have finished. We are actually done with the fourth world.
Yes.
We are still sitting with all the ramification of the crap that has been induced,
Right.
but we are now realizing we need to transform that, and in that process you see those who support it and those who are not supporting it because they
Right.
still want to be in control. But this is a key moment. It was those two to coming together,
Yes.
you know, in the fourth world that will create the circumstances for the next one.
Right.
So,
Yes.
do we fully understand all aspects of the third world? No. But do we understand that there was a critical phase, because that's why there is so much chaos, in order to reach this point. This is also chaos, yes. You know.
Okay.
So now we need to get out of the chaos,
Sure.
and that is why this centeredness and realization of, you know, that's why it's so beautiful that more people begin to meditate, because that's how to get out of the chaos, right?
Sure.
And so that is how I can oversee it, but there's a lot of gaps in
Right.
that story also for
Yes.
everyone, I think. But everyone of, you know, take Casey or anybody else, they all try to define the awareness that there's all kinds of shifts and changes,
Right.
and that there are periods where that was the accent and then that was the accent and that, and now the accent is how can we, now the integration has taken place, we have the proper body, this holds every potential possibility that we need.
Okay.
How can we now stimulate that potential and bring more of that spiritual essence in such a way that we can move into the next phase? Yeah, and now we are back to the fourth waves and all those waves and other things, and
Sure.
I think it's very beautiful that we are at this point.
Okay.
As chaotic as it is,
Yes.
as difficult and complex it is to understand what's really going on.
At least it's changing. It's
Yeah.
not repeating.
No, I don't think so. That doesn't
No.
mean that there are not people that repeat old patterns,
Oh, I agree.
but that's different. Overall, what we see is you cannot completely hold on to the old anymore. It's not possible.
I think that's the whole, you know, the Mayan Baktun that ended in 2012. That was that whole cycle, and now we've started the new, and that's why people are in such fear. Is they say, oh, it's COVID or something like this, but it's really that this shift is happening, and they sense it.
Yeah.
They can't articulate it, but they're like, well, I just want to hold on to the old way.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so,
but COVID was actually an opportunity to make changes.
yes,
And there are definitely changes that
Oh, I
have been
agree.
used.
yes,
You know, did it as far as we had hoped? No. But every impulse is an impulse.
correct.
And yes, every impulse you see is going back partly, but never completely to the old.
Oh, I agree.
Now we need another one. Because all the wars, I think, is another impulse.
Agreed.
Now, what will happen now? You know? So and it will continue that way.
I agree. So,
So
okay,
that's at least my 2 cents about the whole thing.
sure. I think Casey's more focusing on, you know, it was the Atlanteans were in the same geographic location. They were on that island in the Atlantic Ocean, blah blah blah. And so he sees it as a continuity. He doesn't see it in terms of consciousness and are you in the
No.
third or the
No,
fourth
no,
world?
no,
And so
no.
that's
I
why.
understand that.
Okay.
I understand that.
So
From a certain perspective, you can say, as a culture or whatever you want to call it, it's one continuum, yes.
right.
In the same way as the Shi or one continuum, where they went through 5 different levels of consciousness, you know, of the Shi, well, the second world, the Lemurians.
Right.
So, yeah, it is what we see as a continuum in reality as continuous changes.
True.
So it depends on how you look at it, how you define it.
Agreed. Yes. Okay. Thank you.